the Odyssey. What I was playing here was the Odyssey as it would have been heard on a lyre in their language. And what's being sung here is this in English. Sing to me of the man, Muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again off course. Once he had plundered the hallowed heights of Troy. Many cities of men he saw and learned their minds. Many pains he suffered, heartsick on the open sea, fighting to save his life and to bring his comrades home. But he could not save them from disaster, hard as he strove. The recklessness of their own ways destroyed them all. The blind fools, they devoured the cattle of the sun, and the sun god wiped them from sight the day of their return. Launch out on his story, Muse, daughter of Zeus. Start from where you will. Sing for our time too. I love that last line. Sing for our time too. And in fact, that's what we're doing tonight. We're examining and singing the Odyssey for our time too. All right, what's the story here? The story is 10 years after the Trojan War, and the Trojan War itself was 10 years, we find Odysseus in the Odyssey on the Isle of Calypso. Actually, last year during passages, we examined a passage from that book 5 in the Odyssey with Calypso and Odysseus. Calypso is a goddess who lives on her own island, Ogygia, and Odysseus washes up on shore there. And she loves him and promises to make him immortal. But he thinks only of home, and in fact, of his beloved Penelope. And so the gods intervene. He is king of Ithaca, by the way, and has been away for 20 years. So he's had a son, Telemachus, who is grown up now. He's about 20. And he also has a wife, Penelope, who is in their home, but being tormented by about 100 suitors, or 120, I think it is, suitors, people who want her. But in fact, in the ancient world, to want her is to want Odysseus's estate, his lands and cattle, and property. And so she's tormented by these suitors. And she is really the subject tonight. I was once in love with Calypso, but now I'm in love with Penelope. So I've evolved, clearly. No, she's really interesting. That's true. I've always been fascinated by Calypso, and I've always said Odysseus should never have left the island, but that's another story, and I'll take that up with my therapist. Penelope, very interesting Penelope that we're going to learn about tonight. One of the things I love about the Odyssey is the deep metaphors it holds. One of them is, well, we'll talk about them at the end, but one of them is veiling, the sense of covering, hiding, and the other is weaving. And these things are related, of course, because you must weave a veil. But both Calypso and Penelope are weavers. Calypso has a loom deep in her home, in her cave, and Penelope weaves to save her life. And so she says that Odysseus' father, Laertes, is about to die, so she's weaving him a funeral shroud. So she comes out every day and meets the suitors who are hanging out in the courtyard of her home, and she's like, look, I'll make a decision when I finish this. So she sits there all day weaving. And then at night, she unweaves. Right? And this puts her off, puts them off. think that's a powerful metaphor for women's lives that we'll talk about. Telemachus, too, senses the urgency of what's about to happen. She can't hold out much longer, Penelope, and so he goes in search of his father. So this kind of sets up the plot of the story. Athena, then, who's the prime mover in this story, intervenes to help Telemachus come home. She makes sure he heads that way. And she's veiled all the time, too. She often appears veiled, hidden. People don't recognize her. She's masked. And the suitors hear of this, and they plan to assassinate Telemachus, the son. On the other hand, Zeus, Athena has asked Zeus to let Odysseus go. I'm not sure he couldn't have gone any time he wanted, but whatever. She says, release Odysseus from Calypso. And Zeus is bothered by this. He's like, this is small stuff. You're talking about two people? You're talking about a goddess and a man? What am I doing? I don't want to deal with this. So he's like, yeah, whatever, go ahead. So he sends Hermes or Mercury down, and that was the scene, part of the scene we talked about last summer, is when Calypso is forced by Zeus through Hermes to enable Odysseus' escape from her island. She has an amazing speech in there where she calls the gods to task. And she's so interesting because she doesn't want to deal with the gods. She wants to be on her island. Anyway, you can see all these machinations happening, and now Telemachus and Odysseus are both headed home now. All right, so so remember the story. The Odyssey begins in medias res, we call it, in the middle of things. And so he's on Calypso's island. And so when he is released, he lands in the territory of Alcinous, the king Alcinous of the Phaeacians. And so here's this man, and he's known. This is the guy who defeated Troy, right, with the Trojan horse. That was his strategy. And so they're like, who are you? And he's like, well, I'm Odysseus. And they're like, oh, you must tell us the story. And of course, the story is of the lotus eaters who make you forget about home, right? The Cyclops, Polyphemus, the one-eyed monster, the winds of Aeolus that the sailors open and blow back when they're trying to get home. Circe, the witch who turns men into swine. The underworld, he has to go into the underworld because that's required in these ancient epics to meet people. The sirens, their song that leads to death. And remember, Odysseus has his men lash him to the mast so he won't heed their call. And then Scylla and Charybdis, the monster in the whirlpool that they have to navigate. So Poseidon is the one who's pissed at Odysseus because the Cyclops is that's his Poseidon's son, and so that happens early on, and so Poseidon is now after him, after Odysseus and his men. So Odysseus lands on this island. He meets Prince Nausicaa too, by the way, which is interesting, and everybody gathers around and so he tells this story here. He tells everything that's happened. And then he says this, and I actually loved this line. He says, I drifted along 9 days after this last disaster when he lost his ship and what's left of he lost everybody. He lost his 3 ships, and he lost all of his men, about 200, I think. I drifted along 9 days. On the 10th at night, the gods cast me up on Ogygia, Calypso's island, home of the dangerous nymph with the glossy braids, who speaks with human voice. And she took me in. She loved me. Why cover the same ground again? Just yesterday, here at the hall, I told you all the rest, you and your gracious wife. It goes against my grain to repeat a tale told once and told so clearly. He doesn't want to tell the story. Let's think about why as we understand the story and move through it. I think it's the opposite problem. He knows only too well. Yeah. All right, so here's the rest of the text. His tale was over now. The Phaeacians all fell silent, hushed, his story holding them spellbound down the shadowed halls, until Alcinous found the poise to say, Odysseus, now that you've come to my bronze-floored house, my vaulted roofs, I know you won't be driven off your course. Nothing can hold you back. However much you've suffered, you'll sail home. Okay, well, there it is. 20 years, all told. And finally, home is within reach. And he's got help. Instead of fighting witches and goddesses and cyclops and ocean phenomena and gods, he's headed home and he has help. This is incredible. And there's a great image of him landing on Ithaca. So he's home. I love this. Listen to this. Odysseus woke from sleep on native ground at last. He'd been away for years, but failed to know the land, for the goddess Pallas Athena, Zeus's daughter, showered mist all over, so that under cover she might change his appearance head to foot as she told him every peril he'd meet at home. Wait, what? Every peril? He just got out of peril. Now there's peril at home? Oh yeah, there's a lot. And she's going to keep him from being known by his wife, townsmen, and friends until the suitors paid the price for their outrage. And so to the king himself, all Ithaca looked strange. He sprang to his feet and, scanning his own native country, groaned, slapped his thighs with his flat palms, and cried in anguish, Man of misery, whose land have I lit on now? What are they here, violent, savage, lawless, or friendly to strangers, God-fearing men? When you come home, you're lost. When you come home, you don't recognize it. And you know what? You are not recognized either. So then a lot happens, and I'm not going to go through too much of the plot here, but I want to summarize it so we can get to the passage for tonight. Odysseus is made into a beggar, to appear as a beggar, because again, veiling, right? Eventually he enters the city, his city, where his home is, his palace. I love this little story in book 17. Only an aged, toothless, abandoned dog recognizes him. Isn't that perfect? The dog is covered with sores, lying in a pile of shit, and wags his tail and dies. Really? So, yeah, this was Argus. His name was Argus, and he was, at one time, Odysseus's favorite hunting dog. So he recognizes him and then dies. And this is a tale of misery, right? The dog lifts his head, whimpers, and Odysseus has to hide his tears because he shouldn't know this dog, right? He's a stranger. He's a beggar who's just come into town at the palace. And in fact, Antinous sees him, one of the suitors, sees him and curses the ragged beggar and hits him with a footstool. Penelope sees this, does not know who the ragged beggar is, only sees that what Antinous did was wrong, and so tells him to back off and gives the beggar Odysseus permission to stay at the palace in the courtyard. This is her long-lost husband, whom she's been waiting for, but she doesn't recognize him because after you've completed most of the journey, you are unrecognizable, especially to those who love you, who are at home, who haven't gone on the journey. Another beggar, Eris, gets enraged and tries to bully Odysseus because he's taking his spot on the corner, his begging spot. Again, the irony is so rich here because he's the king of Ithaca. He's the man of many wiles. He's the protagonist. He won the Trojan War. But without that recognition, he is just another beggar who gets beat up and arranges to have a boxing match with this other beggar. Odysseus breaks the beggar's jaw. And people are like, oh, okay, different kind of beggar. Now Athena, because Athena's always moving things behind the scenes, she puts it into Penelope's head to make an appearance before the suitors. The goddess makes her taller and more beautiful, as Athena does, to inflame their hearts. And when Penelope speaks to the suitors, she says this: Odysseus has instructed me to take a new husband if he fails to return before Telemachus begins growing facial hair. I guess he's younger than 20. Then she says to the suitors, the man I will marry will be the man who brings me the greatest gift. All right. So the suitors shower her with presents. Odysseus is there watching, smiling. He tries to talk to one of the handmaids, Penelope's handmaids, and she insults him because he's an inferior and a drunk. Again, it's not going well. His return is not going well, although he did break that guy's jaw. Now Athena stirs up some more trouble, where Eurymachus throws a stool at him and misses and hits a servant. I mean, it's kind of comedic, right? He throws at Odysseus. I imagine Odysseus dodging, and he hits somebody else, right? And then a riot is about to break out among the suitors. Telemachus steps in and diffuses the situation and says, calm down. Here's a beautiful section in Book 19 where Odysseus' nurse, Eurycleia, she cared for him as a child, and she is taking care of him. I forget what prompts her to. He might have gone up and asked her to help with a wound or something, and she sees a scar that Odysseus had as a child from an attack by a boar. And she sees the scar and says, "Oh, this is Odysseus." Now I love that it's the outcast, it's the dog, it's the nurse, it's the people who aren't in power who can see through the veil, right? Because they have other ways of seeing. The dog seeing, and then nurse seeing by knowing this man's wounds, even from childhood. So Penelope continues to be tricky and to keep putting off the suitors, and she announces that on the next day she will marry the suitor who can duplicate what Odysseus, her husband, who is now clearly gone, whoever can duplicate his feat of shooting an arrow through 12 rows of axes, the axes with the holes in the head. And so they set up the axes, and Odysseus one time shot an arrow through 12 of them. No small feat. And she says, all right, whoever can do that tomorrow, that's the guy I marry, and this will all be over. So that night, they both Penelope and Odysseus have a rough night. They don't know how things are going to come out. Fortunately, we as readers do. The suitors, meanwhile, are pissed at Telemachus and decide to kill him. You can see things are coming to a head. The contest begins. The suitors have trouble even stringing the bow because they're losers. And then, of course, Odysseus shoots right through the axes again. Meanwhile, Telemachus has ordered the women in the household to stay out of their quarters, or in their quarters and out of sight, and other aides remove the weapons from the room. All right, so everyone is amazed at what Odysseus has done, and then he starts killing the suitors. They are now unarmed because the weapons have been removed, and his son Telemachus is with him, and they kill them all. And then this strange thing happens. So Penelope has these handmaids, and they decide that they must die too. And here's the text. And then at last, once the entire house was put in order, they marched the women out of the great hall between the roadhouse and the courtyard's strong stockade, crammed them into a dead end, no way out from there. And stern Telemachus gave the men their orders. No clean death for the likes of them, by God, not from me. They showered abuse on my head, my mother's too, you sluts, the suitors' whores. And with that, taking a cable used on a dark prowed ship, he coiled it over the round house, lashed it fast to a tall column, hoisting it up so high that no toes could touch the ground. Then, as doves or thrushes, beating their spread wings against some snare rigged up in the thickets, flying in for a cozy nest, but a gristly bed receives them, so the women's heads were trapped in a line, nooses yanking their necks up, one by one, so that all might die, a pitiful, ghastly death. They kicked up heels for a little, but not too long. Jesus. Why is that in there? Actually, there might be an answer to that. Now it's total bloodshed and destruction. And the suitors are taken care of. The handmaids are taken care of for some reason. Penelope and Odysseus are now alone, finally. It's been 20 years. They've both been through so much. And now here is the text. Dear old nurse, Penelope responded, deep as you are, my friend, you'll find it hard to plumb the plans of everlasting gods. All the same, let's go and join my son so that I can see the suitors lying dead and see the one who killed them. She still doesn't know it was her husband. With that, though Penelope started down from her lofty room, her heart in turmoil, torn, should she keep her distance, probe this person, or rush up to the man at once and kiss his head and cling to both hands? As soon as she stepped across the stone threshold, slipping in, she took a seat at the closet wall and, radiant in the firelight, faced Odysseus now. Listen to this. This is fantastic. There he sat, leaning against the great central column, his eyes fixed on the ground, waiting, poised for whatever words his hearty wife might say when she caught sight of him. A long while she sat in silence. Numbing wonder filled her heart as her eyes explored his face. One moment he seemed Odysseus, to the life. The next, no, he was not the man she knew. A huddled mass of rags was all she saw. Oh, mother, Telemachus reproached her, cruel mother with your hard heart, why do you spurn my father so? Why not do you sit beside him, engage him, ask him questions? What other wife would have a spirit so unbending? Holding back from her husband, home at last for her after bearing 20 years of brutal struggle, your heart was always harder than a rock. All right. My child, Penelope, well aware, explained, I'm stunned with wonder, powerless. I cannot speak to him, ask him questions, look him in the eyes. But if he is truly Odysseus, home at last, make no mistake, we'll know each other even better. We too have secret signs known to us both, but hidden from the world. Here we go. Another wonderful passage here. He stepped from the bath, glistening like a god, and back he went to the seat that he had left, and facing his wife declared, I love you so much, I've missed you. No, he doesn't say that. He says, strange woman, so hard. The gods of Olympus made you harder than any other woman in the world. What other wife could have a spirit so unbending, holding back from her husband, home at last for her after bearing 20 years of brutal struggle? Come, nurse, make me a bed. I'll sleep alone. She has a heart of iron in her breast. All right, that's going well. Strange man. See, doesn't he say, yes, he begins, strange woman. Her response is, strange man. Wary Penelope said, I'm not so proud, so scornful, nor am I overwhelmed by your quick change. You look, how well I know, the way he looked, setting sail from Ithaca years ago aboard the long-oared ship. Yeah, so there it is. There's the moment. Yes, applause, right, of unveiling. And then, come, Euryclea, she says to the nurse. She's still not done. Listen, come, Euryclea, move the sturdy bedstead out of our bridal chamber. Move the bed out of the bridal chamber, that room that the master built with his own hands. Take it out now, sturdy bed that it is, and spread it deep with fleece, blankets, and lustrous throws to keep him warm. Putting her husband to the proof. But Odysseus blazed up in fury, lashing out at his loyal wife. Woman, your words, they cut me to the core. Who could move my bed? Impossible task, even for some skilled craftsman, unless a god came down in person, quick to lend a hand, lifted it out with ease, and moved it elsewhere. She still needed proof. Penelope felt her knees go slack, her heart surrender, recognizing the strong, clear signs Odysseus offered. She dissolved in tears, rushed to Odysseus, flung her arms around his neck and kissed his head and cried out. Well, I'll tell you later how she knew the bed. Odysseus, don't flare up at me, not now. Always the most understanding man alive. The gods, it was the gods who sent us sorrow. They grudged us both a life in each other's arms, from the heady zest of youth to the stoop of old age. But don't fault me, angry with me now because I failed at first glimpse to greet you, hold you. The more she spoke, the more a deep desire for tears welled up inside his breast. This is the passage for tonight. He wept as he held the wife he loved, the soul of loyalty, in his arms at last. Their bed, Odysseus had made their bed from an olive tree in the courtyard and built the house around it. So when Penelope tells Euryclea, move the bed out here, we'll make it awesome, she needs to make sure it's him. And so he gets pissed and says, our bed can't be moved. And you should know that. And so that's how they come together. All right, the more she spoke, the more a deep desire for tears welled up inside his breast. He wept as he held the wife he loved, the soul of loyalty, in his arms at last. Joy, warm as the joy that shipwrecked sailors feel when they catch sight of land. Poseidon has struck their well-rigged ship on the open sea with gale winds and crushing walls of waves, and only a few escape, swimming, struggling out of the frothing surf to reach the shore, their bodies crusted with salt, but buoyed up with joy as they plant their feet on solid ground again, spared a deadly fate. Wow, that's a really long metaphor. Okay, but whose metaphor is it? Odysseus's, right? So joyous now to her, the sight of her husband, vivid in her gaze, that her white arms, embracing his neck, would never for a moment let him go. Dawn, with her rose-red fingers, might have shone upon their tears, if with her glinting eyes Athena had not thought of one more thing. She held back the night, and night lingered along the western edge of the earth, while in the east she reined in dawn of the golden throne at ocean's banks, commanding her not to yoke the windswift's team that brings men light, blaze, and aurora, the young colts that race the morning on. But come, Odysseus says, let's go to bed, dear woman. At long last, delight in sleep, delighting each other, of course. Now, here's a response from Penelope that you don't often hear, and I think it says a lot about her. If it's bed you want, it's bed you'll have. Whenever the spirit moves you, now that the gods have brought you home again to native land, your grand and gracious house. And so, after 23 books of torture and loss and battle and scheming on the part of enemies, they are finally together. By the way, that's not the end of the Odyssey. There's more battle. In fact, right after this, Odysseus says, well, I got something bad to tell you. There's more trouble coming. And a lot of scholars think that actually was added on later. So I'm going to stop right there. Dorothy Parker, you know Dorothy Parker, she's fantastic. She's the one who said, was reported to have said that Los Angeles is 72 villages in search of a center. This is her little poem, Penelope. Penelope, in the pathway of the sun, in the footsteps of the breeze, where the world and the sky are one, he shall ride the silver seas, he shall cut the glittering wave. I shall sit at home and rock, rise to heed a neighbor's knock, brew my tea and snip my thread, bleach the linen for my bed. They will call him brave. They will call him brave, we might say. All right, what are the ways to wisdom here? I think there are many, and I'm not alone, because the Odyssey is probably the most read book in the world, right after Art of the Deal. Sorry, that was cheap. What are the ways to wisdom here? Well, we talked about this last summer with Calypso. Calypso, the word means to hide or to veil. All right, so this is before the music, Calypso music. This is ancient Greek. To hide or to veil. And so Calypso herself, the goddess, is in fact veiled on her island of Ogygia. Nobody knows she's there. The gods know she's there, but no mortals know she's there. She's veiled. This is her life. This is the life she wants, to be alone on her island. She is veiled. When Odysseus lands on her island, she invites him to be veiled as well, to be hidden, to be covered, because no one will ever know what happened to him, right? He will disappear. Again, I think that's a pretty attractive thing, to disappear, to be veiled, especially after you've been through everything that Odysseus has been through, and especially if it's with a divine being who promises only to love you, care for you, and eventually make you divine yourself. Not a bad deal. But that doesn't make for a good story, because the story ends there and, okay, you're veiled. What happens when Odysseus goes home is apocalypso, unveiling. And you know that word differently, but it's the same meaning. To unveil is to unleash. It is to show the horror, as in the book of Revelation, whose Greek name is apocalypse, right? So the unveiling involves violence and horror, because that's the world that Odysseus is returning to, a world where he is a king whose land and wife and son and estate, and most importantly, his legacy, are threatened. And the only answer to that is blood. And there is plenty of blood in the last books of the Odyssey. So there's the opportunity in life to be hidden and to be revealed, to be calypsoed and to be uncalypsoed, apocalypsoed. I think, for example, when we fall in love, we become calypsoed. And that, of course, works well with the Calypso story. Because when you first fall in love, your friends are like, what are you doing? Why aren't you going out with us? What's happening? Did you meet someone? Yes, we did. And in fact, what we're doing in love is creating a new world. We're creating a geisha. However, to come out of that world with a breakup or something like that is an apocalypse. It's an unveiling of the world that you have built with your lover, and you see it for what it... Well, let's not get into that. I'll let you discuss that if you want. And power are sustaining a mythology that gives you the script on how to live. It's a story that says, all right, when you're this old, you should do this, and you should get a job here or in this field, and then next comes children, and then next comes a home, perhaps, and then you do this, and then you do that. You have a beautiful script laid out for you by the myth. If you're not part of that myth, if you don't exist for that myth, then you must be inventive. And that's why I think, and I'm not the first person to say this, that so much of our most innovative and powerful literature and art comes from people who are disenfranchised from the dominant culture. Because they must do this every day. They must find a way. Just as Penelope had to find a way. She's got 120 suitors at her door every day, and they're ready to move. They're eating up, first of all her livestock and food, because that you have to do that in the ancient world. You can't have a guest, even if it's a jerk, 120 jerks, you've still got to feed them. This is the law of hospitality in the ancient world. And so they're eating her out of house and home. They're threatening her. The only thing that keeps them in check is there are 120 of them, so someone's got to win. So they want her to choose one of them. But that choice is the opportunity for that choice is about to run out. And you can sense that in the text, right? Like, they're almost ready to just take her. In fact, there's already a bunch of fights at the beginning when Odysseus comes in as the beggar. The tension is high, and violence is right there, ready to happen. And don't think that Penelope wouldn't have been the first victim of that violence. But she keeps it all together by weaving and unweaving, right? Wonderful metaphor for the text as well. The text is the same root as texture and textile. It's a weaving. It's a putting together of things that keeps things together or holds things at bay. Of course, there's always the longing, satisfaction, metaphor, reality. Satisfaction is the death of desire. It's the longing that is more interesting, perhaps. That's the Calypso-Penelope pairing, right? I find it fascinating that Odysseus got everything a man mythologically should have wanted, did want. Love, sex, care from a divine nymph with the lustrous braids. There it is, dude. What more do you want? Well, I actually want a lot more. I don't want this now because I have this now. Okay, I had this now. Now what's next? And it's interesting that he goes back, but of course you can't go back really, because 20 years have passed and you won't be known. You won't be seen. And lots of things have changed. Longing and satisfaction. Satisfaction is the death of desire. Of course, women and men, there's plenty to talk about here. Calypso, Penelope, the handmaids. Margaret Atwood, of The Handmaid's Tale, by the way, author of that novel, wrote a book several years ago called The Penelopead, in which she gives voice to Penelope and to the handmaids. And Margaret Atwood's a brilliant writer, but she's also a brilliant scholar. She has a master's degree in religious studies and literature from the University of Toronto, and she knew something was going on here. And so she wrote this novel called The Penelopead, where she wants these women to have their voices, and the handmaids are the chorus in the novel, and they're always crying out, why did you do this? And there's no good reason. There's a kind of technical reason in the plot, and is that the handmaids were sleeping with the suitors, but I don't know that they had a choice in that. Anyway, they become collateral deaths in the apocalypse of the return. And then, I love this line from the Penelopead I wanted to share with you. This is Penelope speaking in the novel. If a man, and this is about Odysseus coming back and hiding himself, disguising himself. And Penelope says this: if a man takes pride in his disguise skills, it would be a foolish wife who would claim to recognize him. If a man takes pride in hiding himself, it would be a foolish wife to not let him carry on. It's always an imprudent step between a man and the reflection of his own cleverness. Interesting. And then, of course, there is the road and home. Odysseus is from the root hodos, which is the same word in exodus, which means in Greek, the road out. Odysseus is the road. Penelope is home. What does that mean? That means so much, I'm not even sure I know where to start. Does woman represent home to a man? Is that when he stops fighting and running around? And he's always trying to get home, but why? Especially why when he's on an island with the goddess? What is pulling him back home? And you don't get to say with the Odyssey that it is the peace and serenity of home, because you can't walk through Odysseus' courtyard without blood coming up to your ankles. So it's not that, right? Or maybe it's a different version of that, I don't know. The road and home. I don't know if you've been on the road ever, but there's a great line. Is it Neil Young? On the road, there's no place like home. It's interesting. I used to think myself that the road was home, and that worked for a while, but then maybe I got old enough to find that the road isn't home, that home is home. Anyway, I sound like an idiot, so I'll stop talking about personal stuff. There's so much interesting. I just find Penelope so interesting, and I've never really looked at her before because I was always attracted to Calypso. So I wanted to give you a sense of some of the artwork that's out there about her. And in fact, you'll see a couple of scenes here from Margaret Atwood's Penelopead that was turned into a play. All right, so I'm going to let this run while we talk. Thank you for your attention.